and white trash talking.
Hi, I'm Doug Johnson, and I'm White Trash Talking. Today I want to look at the shift in power dynamics between the U.S. and countries of Southeast Asia, particularly China, as it relates to possible war over Taiwan. As the U.S.'s ability to project power diminishes, it is pushing its allies, Japan, South Korea, and Australia, onto the front lines to fight on behalf of the U.S., much like NATO is doing in Ukraine. In fact, creating an Asian NATO was proposed by Japan's president, Ishiba, and then rejected outright by neighboring countries. Here is Warwick Powell, adjunct professor at Queensland University of Technology, a senior fellow at Taipei Institute, Beijing, and the author of China, Trust, and Digital Supply Chains, to discuss the shifting power dynamics.
The United States is really seeking to push a lot more responsibility onto its European allies, personnel, materials, and finances, to take on the battles in Europe. And I think a similar mindset and a similar policy framework is being applied in Asia as well. From an Asian perspective, though, this change in configuration also creates a different set of possibilities. It is a signal to countries in the region that, in fact, the United States is seeking to do a few things. One is to retrench its own direct exposure in the region and direct commitments in the region. Secondly, to push others to the front line to take over the load and to take over the risks. But in doing so, it opens a window for countries to elbow a little bit more autonomy and independence. And I think all of that is at play at the moment. There's nothing set in stone. What was once solid is melting into air very, very quickly. The other challenge I think the United States has is that as much as it wants to provoke the conflicts and to push others into fighting America's wars and to arm them and profit from that process, and if it all goes bad, it'll back out and seek to pretend to be a mediator while it's a co-belligerent. We're dealing with countries such as Japan, for example, that has its own sense of what it is to be Japanese. And whilst it has been a client state in effect, and an occupied client state for the best part of the last 80 years, there has been a long-standing bubbling away of a Japanese nationalism to one extent or another. And I think we are starting to see some moves of the Japanese body politic seeking to extricate itself a little bit from underneath America's shadow. And the current Japanese Prime Minister has, I think, some interesting perspectives on this. He's, of course, advanced the idea of an Asian NATO, but in doing so, it comes with this proposition that, in fact, which of course the Americans reject outright, that the Japanese should have bases on American territories in the Pacific under the same extraterritorial arrangements that American bases operate on Japanese soil. And of course, this latest round of tariffs that have been unfolded by the Trump administration has taken Tokyo to some extent by surprise, because the supposed special relationship that exists between Japan and the United States really isn't that special at all. When you go to the Republic of Korea, the public is increasingly doubtful that the American protective umbrella, its nuclear umbrella, will ultimately, in practical terms, extend to Korea. There is no expectation, actually, in Korea that Washington will put Washington, New York, Boston, Los Angeles, San Francisco, or wherever at risk of being attacked by the DPRK in defense of Seoul. So again, the efforts by the United States to divide and conquer, to push others to the front, it's something that you can't, or the United States can't fully control. You know, once you let the genie out of the bottle, countries with their own ambitions are going to see these as both risks because it destabilizes the situation, but opportunities because the situation is unstable. And I think we're starting to see some of that play out.
The focal point of U.S. aggression against China is Taiwan, which the U.S. claims to be protecting against a Chinese military invasion. What I want to do now is show how this issue is a complete fabrication meant to deceive the U.S. public into supporting yet another war. The issues surrounding Taiwan and China were settled almost 50 years ago in what is commonly known as the One China policy. Prior to that, in 1949, the Civil War in China effectively ended. The PRC took control of the mainland, while the ROC, the previous government, the losing side, retreated to Taiwan. According to the Congressional Research Service, quote, on January 1st, 1979, the U.S. government recognized the government of the People's Republic of China, the PRC, as the sole legal government of China and severed official diplomatic relations with the Taiwan-based Republic of China, the ROC, end quote. It goes on to say that, quote, the undertakings from that era underpin the U.S.'s One China policy, and experts widely credit them with maintaining peace on the Taiwan Strait, end quote. Between 1971 and 1982, the U.S.-China agreement was deepened. Quote, President Nixon's groundbreaking 1972 trip to China yielded the Shanghai Communique. In the document, the U.S. government acknowledges that all Chinese on either side of the Taiwan Strait maintain there is but one China and Taiwan is a part of China, and states that the U.S. government does not challenge that position. The U.S. side also reaffirms its interest in a peaceful settlement of the Taiwan question by the Chinese themselves, and affirms the ultimate objective of withdrawal of U.S. forces and military installations from Taiwan, end quote. So what is the problem? This sounds great. How could there be anything wrong? Here's the problem. It says, quote, on January 26, 1979, after the United States broke official ties with the ROC, the Carter administration transmitted to Congress a bill to establish a framework of unofficial relations with Taiwan, end quote. It goes on to say, quote, the Taiwan Relations Act, the TRA, states that the United States will make available to Taiwan such defense articles and defense services in such quantity as may be necessary to enable Taiwan to maintain a sufficient self-defense capability. The TRA also states that it is U.S. policy to maintain the capacity of the United States to resist any resort to force or other forms of coercion that would jeopardize the security or the social or economic system of the people of Taiwan, end quote. The U.S. agreed to a One China policy, to taking a hands-off approach, and then spent the next 40-plus years arming Taiwan and stoking conflict. The U.S. now has China in its crosshairs, and they're pushing the phony Taiwan conflict as the flashpoint. Warwick Powell talks about the likely outcome of any U.S.-China escalation over Taiwan.
So what the Americans want is to provoke China into some kind of a military response. I don't think China will respond, and in fact I think if the Americans push too hard, the risk that they run actually is that China's response will be to rapidly create a defensive cordon around the island in the name of national sovereignty and defence, bearing in mind, of course, that it views the island, and the rest of the world by and large views the island too, as part of one China. So this is not an occupation, it's not an invasion, it's literally a defensive cordon. And when it does that, it's actually inviting the Americans to challenge that. Are the Americans going to do that? Are the Americans going to do it with their own people and their own machines? Or are they going to try to push the Japanese into doing it, or the Filipinos, or even the Australians? I seriously doubt that any of these other countries is going to play that game, because there's nothing in it for them in the end. And the risk the United States runs on this score is that it will be confronted with a choice that it will need to make. Does it seek to break the Chinese defensive cordon around the island, fire the first shot, try to run through the maritime cordon, or penetrate a no-fly zone, or does it back off? I think the other thing that they run the risk of, and I mean the United States, is that This will be seen as the last move of the great bully. The attempts to divide Europe and particularly break Russia up, I think, have been floundering quite badly. The mess that it's left in the Middle East continues, of course, to fester. But China's a totally different kettle of fish, particularly China of 2025. If the Americans want to have missiles pointed at China, they're going to ultimately need magnets that are made by China, and I don't think China's going to help America point missiles at it. Again, reality will trump the ambitions, whatever those ambitions are, and the sort of simulacra beliefs of American greatness and this bottomless pit of American military capability. It's not bottomless. It's actually incredibly dependent on Chinese supply chains. And frankly, the Americans would be better off to arrive at a sensible détente with China, number one, but ultimately just become a normal country, right? Just be normal.
This is what the world wants, for the U.S. to be normal. Start acting civilized. Stop bullying. Recently, in the Western press, there's been reports that China is planning for a 2027 military invasion of Taiwan. This Brookings article asks, will 2027 invite conflict for Taiwan and China? Another says China, Taiwan, and the PLA's 2027 milestone. And another, China defense drills identify 2027 for potential China invasion for first time. Warwick Powell addresses this so-called deadline and assesses China's readiness to defend against any aggressors.
I think America has a way of setting the benchmark for many things and then framing everything else around this benchmark as if it's a truth. This 2027 thing, I think, has been subsequently rationalized in all sorts of ways, whether it's because it's, a particular phase in PLA modernization, whether or not it's some kind of a deadline where the PLA will be demonstrably superior in capability compared to the Americans, and therefore, the Americans must act before then. It's hard to know exactly what it is, but having these sorts of timeframes in place is a great way of keeping people on edge and justifying all sorts of activity, including, of course, more funds into the military-industrial complex, a diversion of national resources away from, sensible economic and social objectives towards militarization objectives, and I think that's what 2027 actually does. There has never been any indications at all from the Chinese side about any dates whatsoever, number one, and I think it's important to also note that from the Chinese side, there is a very, very strong preference for reunification to take place without any military force involved at all. And provided that Beijing remains hopeful that reunification can take place in that format, then Beijing will be forever patient. As far as preparations go, though, the People's Liberation Army continues to modernize without a doubt. Its capabilities, I think, have reached a point where few would doubt its capacity to defend itself and to defend the Chinese homeland. But it has the capability, I think, of delivering incredibly high volume and intensive drone defenses. And of course, China also has hypersonic missile delivery capabilities. The Dongfeng or the DF-41, for example, is able to reach speeds of Mach 27, delivering 10 separate nuclear warheads with a delivery distance of between 12,000 and 15,000 kilometers. It can actually go across the Pacific in 30 minutes.
As the U.S. becomes more and more desperate to forestall China's rise and the U.S.'s fall, the mask has slipped off, exposing the U.S. as a rogue state, as non-compliant with international law and increasingly out of touch with reality. U.S. instability pushes U.S. allies away, and it drives the countries of the global South together under the more stable, law-abiding, and civilized BRICS alliance. Waging war on China will not go well for the U.S. As Warwick Powell says, it would be the last move of the great bully. That's all I have. Please like and subscribe. Please leave a comment, and I'll see you next week. Thank you very much.